I think you have to be really careful in Samoa because there is a pretty sizable Palangi population with white people. And if you don't make an effort, you can leave. I knew someone who left Samoa and had no Samoan friends because they only hung out with other people from off island. So I think on the weekends I tried to hang out with my Samoan friends as much as possible and just explored the island.
Thanks, Amber. You touched on it a little bit, the different ways to integrate into the community. Did you find it easy to integrate into the community? Why or why not during your time as a volunteer?
Um, Superficially, it seems really easy when you first get there because everyone's so fascinated by you. But then you quickly realize that you're still an outsider, no matter what. So it really does take some effort to, like I said, going to church or going to I went to every football game. I went to I coached basketball and I'm terrible at basketball. I went to every soccer game. I went to every village diva or dance. I mean, I did everything I possibly could to really get to know the people. And then I would say after maybe 3 months or so, I finally felt like I was no longer looked at as an outsider. But you always have to remember in Samoa, and it's probably like this on all the islands, that the coconut wireless is a thing. And that just means that no matter what you do, someone is going to see you and they're going to talk about you, especially if you're not from Samoa. So, and I'm sure it's like that in Micronesia and the Marshall Islands as well. So you have to be really careful about your conduct because you're being watched all the time, even if you don't realize it.
Thanks, Amber. The next part we look at, which is unique for American Samoa, is the praxis exam is required for all volunteers in order to prove their English proficiency and therefore receive funding. This exam is required for local American Samoan English teachers as well, and the reality is a lot of them are not passing the exam. For that reason, our volunteers must pass it to teach there. Amber, did you find the exam difficult?
No, and in fact, I think we were the first WorldTeach class or whatever to have to take it. I'm pretty sure we were. So we actually took it on island, and I don't remember who paid for it, but I think that the Department of Education for American Samoa paid for it, and I'm pretty sure they have to take it before they go now, right? But anyway, I found it to be extremely easy. If you speak English, it's not a problem at all. But the vicious cycle of Samoa is that because they're an American territory, they are supposed to be teaching in English and learning English, and therefore the American government assumes that they speak English and all their materials are in English, but the reality is that I would say at least half the teachers' English was, spotty at best, which means the students' English is not very good either. I know a good Samoan friend that didn't pass the practice that thought it was really difficult. Because, to be honest, it's taking a test in another language, and they don't get any more time to read and digest than we do who speak English natively. So the language situation in Samoa is very strange because they will say that everyone speaks English, but that's an absolute lie. So yeah, I thought it was easy. It was not easy for a lot of the Samoan teachers.
Thanks, Amber, for that. We're going to move along to the next Pacific Island placement, which is the Marshall Islands. Some of our most remote placements, though it also has more urban islands, such as Majuro and Ibai, which are home to over 2/3 of the Marshallese population. Few of the outer islands have electricity or running water, although some houses have solar panels. Recently, a few outer islands have received satellite dishes providing internet and cell service, although they are unreliable and inconsistent. Katie, as you were teaching English in the Marshalls, what was the level of English amongst students and teachers in your school?
In my school, it was really varied. So I taught middle school in Laura. It's on the main island, but it's still a rural placement. I had about 40 to 50 students in each class. Some of them didn't have any English, and some of them were very advanced. So I had to do a lot of group work and a lot of individualized assignments, trying to get everybody engaged in an assignment that was appropriate for their English level.
And Katie, can you just touch upon quickly what sort of resources you had in the classroom?
Those were limited too. We didn't have enough textbooks, but I was close to town, which made it easier to get things like poster board and markers and things like that. So I would say that if you have a place in Madro, it's much easier to get your hands on resources, but you still might not get very many from your school.
Okay, thank you, Katie. And over to Erin quickly. One of the biggest challenges of living in the Marshalls can be isolation. So can you tell us how volunteers manage this and their free time?
Yeah, I think that kind of the image that a lot of people have in regards to isolation is that the outer islands are the ones where you have to deal with that the most. And that's true to an extent. You're on a very small island with a very small population, 100 to 200 people, with limited communication. And so for outer islanders, kind of managing that isolation, we have weekly radio check-ins with the field director and with other volunteers. It's split up into 2 days. And I know that my volunteers this year have really latched onto that. When they feel that they need to talk to someone, sometimes on radio they'll set up a separate time to just talk with another volunteer. They'll come on radio and be able to chat together and use each other as kind of their support system. There's mail, but you get mail about once a month on Outer Island. And Outer Islanders typically get lots of love from family and everyone, sending them things. But then as far as Madro, you are more connected to your home life, your family back home, because you have internet more available. But there's still a bit of isolation even on Madro, I find, and I think it's something that Madro people don't really expect before coming here, because part of the challenge of being a Madro volunteer is you don't typically live with a host family. Sometimes you do in elementary placements, but the majority of our placements on Madro are in the high schools, and for those, the volunteers live in teacher housing, so they live all together for the most part. But it's just, you do feel a bit isolated from the rest of the community, and the Madro people typically have to work a bit harder to get more involved in the community, put themselves out there, kind of out of their comfort zone. But once you take that step, the people are always very welcoming. So yeah, I think it's just managing your expectations for what type of isolation you should be prepared for. Ellen?
Oh, I'm sorry. You couldn't hear me there? I'm sorry. Just moving on from that,
No,
thank you, is how do the volunteers relative to American Samoa integrate into the communities they're placed in the RMI? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I'm sorry, it was cutting out. Can you just repeat what you said?
Can you just elaborate a little bit on how some of the volunteers for WorldTeach integrate into the communities they're placed in the RMI? I mean, comparing it, contrasting it with American Samoa?
Yeah, I think what was said before about American Samoa is kind of spot on about the Marshalls. It was cutting out a bit, so I didn't catch all of it. But for basically, you really need to put yourself out there. For Madro people, I always suggest find whatever your passion is. So there's lots of different opportunities of things to get involved with here in Madro. There's environmental organizations, there's plays that come through, there's sports clubs, races. You can get involved in pretty much anything that you're interested in here on Madro. You just have to take the step to do that, and then people can find kind of their community here on Madro. And then for Outer Islands, definitely your host family are going to be
extremely helpful for kind of getting integrated into the community. Church is also a very, very big thing in the Marshalls. The, the entire population goes to church. Sunday especially, but there's other days throughout the week that women's groups and youth groups will meet, and that's a great way to get integrated into the community. So that's for Metro and for Outer Island. That's a big, big part of the culture.
Great, thank you, Erin. Moving next to Micronesia, we have one of our field directors now on the line, AJ, who was able to come in all the way from there. How are you, AJ? Welcome.
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, good. So as the current field director in Pohnpei, what did some of the volunteers do with their free time? What activities they usually do, or what are some of the safety precautions you've established with them?
Activities, a lot of hiking and boating activities. Pohnpei has some really good hikes, tons of waterfalls. And then, aside from that, it's kind of hard to get out on the water, actually, even though we're on an island. You've got to make friends with some locals with boats, which can be more difficult to do than anticipated. But as far as safety goes, if volunteers leave the lagoon, like go out in the open ocean, we have EPIRBs and life jackets for everybody. We also have life jackets for them to use inside the lagoon. I ask volunteers to always let me know when they're leaving the lagoon, just so I can keep tabs on them. And then we have a water safety training course for water safety that we go over in orientation. And also, one of the aspects of orientation, we discuss hiking safety, how to avoid problems in the jungle, what to look for. Flash floods are a problem, so we address those. And aside from the outdoor stuff, a lot of volunteers get involved in extracurricular things, coaching sports teams, debate team, other after-school clubs, volunteering at the library, and just spending time with host families and local friends.
Great, thank you, AJ. Coming right in. Just as well in the community you're in Pohnpei, how would you say people prioritize education where you lived when you were a volunteer versus now as the field director?
Well, both times I've lived in town in Colonia. I'm actually started as a volunteer at Pix High School, which is the largest high school on the island, and I'm still there now, teaching a couple classes. So things haven't changed too much, but I'd say across our 3 high schools, education is probably prioritized the same. It's not as important as it is back home in the States or elsewhere in Canada, somewhere like that. But I would say since 2 years ago when I started, I think there's definitely more of a shift towards prioritizing education, which has been good. And then that also contrasts with our program at the College of Micronesia in Colonia, where those students are higher achieving students and come from families that prioritize education a little bit more.
Great, thanks, AJ. Quickly, how do you go about finding placements for incoming volunteers? Can you talk a little about that?
Sure. So we have 3 high schools that we work with. Madeleine High School, which is on the east side of the island. Pix High School, which is in Colonia on the north in town. And then Kitchi High School, also called Pohnpei Memorial High School, which is on the western side of the island. So the real difference between those 3 schools is that Pix is the largest. It has about 1,600 students. And that location is in town, so that gives kind of more of an urban feel. Urban would probably be an exaggeration, but cars, some stores, some shops, restaurants. And then in the 2 outer municipalities at Madeleine and Kitchi, those are very rural, very few stores, very few cars, a lot slower out there. You can tell just about as soon as you get 10 minutes outside of town, the island really starts to change. Houses become further apart, more vegetation. So if volunteers are looking for the rural experience, want things a little bit more quiet, we'll try to place them in Kitchi or Manalanim. And if volunteers are looking for more activities to do in a town setting, we try to place them at Kitchi. I mean, in Colonia, the PICS.
Okay, great, AJ. Just an additional question. In terms of the country's status as a U.S. territory and how they view the United States, how did you feel you were received as a mainland U.S. citizen when you first came?
Oh, very warmly received. Pohnpei has some wonderful people on it. Everybody greets you with a smile. If you're walking down the street, you get a big smile. I definitely feel that it's genuine, and I've never had any anti-American or anti-Western sentiment at all. People are always pretty excited to find out where volunteers come from back home, what their families are like, what their lives are like. So very warm welcome.
Great, thank you, AJ. We're going to move on to placements and stipends overall for all of the placements in the Pacific. So if and when you're accepted, you'll find and fill out a volunteer profile form where you list your preferences on what age students you want to teach and what sort of environment you want to live in. For example, whether you prefer to live and work near other volunteers or if you want to be further away. Based off your preferences and experiences, the field director will then place you according to where he or she thinks you'll be the most successful. You'll usually find out this placement a couple weeks before your departure. Housing placements vary tremendously between the three countries. Volunteers will either live with a host family or in teacher apartments. In American Samoa and Micronesia, volunteers will always be placed in pairs or 2 to 3 in a housing situation. Whereas in the Marshall Islands, volunteers will be the only volunteer with their host family. Internet access will vary tremendously, as mentioned. It's rare that you'll have it in your house, but sometimes you'll have it at school, and it can be found in internet cafes. This is true for all three countries. The monthly stipends, as you see above, are listed there. They vary tremendously as well, as they're based on the different costs of living in each country, and also vary by placement within countries. You'll see in some places you'll use part of your stipend to pay for utilities, but that varies by placement. For example, Amber, as a volunteer in American Samoa, you made approximately $400 US. How did you spend that money typically?
Well, the good and bad news about, I think, well, Samoa definitely, and I'm sure even more so than the other two, is that there is not much to buy. So you can easily live on $400, especially because Samoans in particular are obsessed with feeding you. So you could probably go an entire month without having to buy your own food and just going to like church picnics and your host family's tunai, which is like a Sunday afternoon after church picnic, or just eating like the breadfruit out of your front yard. So I spent most of my money on books because there were none, or very few in Samoa, and so and Amazon actually delivers to American Samoa on occasion when the post office decides that they want to give you your stuff. And I mean, honestly, most of my money went to traveling because Western Samoa, which is another country very, very close, both in proximity and culturally, of course, to American Samoa, is very close by. So I think most of my money actually went to like Western Samoa or New Zealand or Australia. I probably spent about $100 or $150 a month on food and living in Samoa. Once I really got to know more Samoans, I hardly ever had to feed myself. So it was, saving as much money as I could so I could go see other things.
Great.
But I will say electricity.
Oh.
My electric bill was usually $60 a month, which doesn't seem like a lot, but that was one thing.
Okay, thank you, Amber. In comparison, Katie, can you address how you budgeted in Marjorie?
Can I just add?
Yeah.
Sorry, this is Leora here.
Hey,
Can I add
Leora.
one thing to the American Samoa
Please.
stipend? Yeah, I would say that especially when a lot of volunteers first get here, there are a lot of startup costs. So the stipend is a stress for them when they first arrive. So there are big grocery stores. There are a lot of off-island foods, imported stuff that you can choose to buy. So I found that at the beginning of the year, especially as say you're buying things like cleaning supplies, uniforms for school, the volunteers were spending more money out of their stipend and they were concerned. But at around the midway point, they felt like it was much more doable living within their stipend. So I would say, it really depends on those relationships. Like, sounds like Amber, did a really awesome job building those relationships at church and getting relationships with her community, which of course impacted her costs. So that it's not always the case for all the volunteers, especially if you come with dietary restrictions, things like that, that are going to impact how you want to choose to spend your food budget. But as the year goes on, you get and you don't have as many startup costs, it's more doable. And also remembering that we are using US dollars, so you don't have the crutch of having savings in US dollars when you're abroad to kind of increase your spending power. So I think that is sometimes a surprise for the volunteers when they arrive, because they expect to be going to a developing country and that things will be cheaper, but sometimes you'll find costs for things you might buy at home are the same, if not a little bit higher, because they're imported. So I found that at first some of the volunteers were anxious about money, but then, again, as they set up their lives, as they didn't have as many startup costs, it has become definitely doable.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I forgot about having to buy uniforms because you have to get yeah, I mean, teachers are really encouraged to wear pulatasi or ies, which are like the traditional Samoan clothing, and you have to buy the fabric for those and get them made. And they're not expensive, but if you have to buy one, you have to buy like 3 or 4 of them, it can get a little bit expensive. And also things like fans, which I would have died if I didn't have a fan in my house probably. And a simple fan that you can buy at like Target here for like $20 is probably gonna be at least twice that on the island, because it's just everything has to be imported. So yeah, startup costs, that's true. It can be really expensive at first.
Thanks, Leora and Amber, for clarifying that in the beginning. Moving to Katie, can you address how you budgeted in Margaro and how much you paid monthly for utilities?
Oh, sure. I didn't. So I lived with a host family. I didn't have to worry about utilities or things like that. Although actually, when I lived, well, yeah, when I lived on my own, I did. But in Laura, there's really nothing to buy. I mean, I would buy my own water. At the time, there was a store there where I'd buy like oranges if I wanted extra fruit. Mostly, mostly you spend money if you end up going into town where there are restaurants and things to tempt you, and maybe more Americanized food if you're missing that. And I know outer island people, they get a lot less, but they also, again, have less to spend money on. And usually they have someone in Madro that's willing to send them stuff throughout the year. But yeah, there's just not a lot to spend your money on, except for like the other girls were saying, upfront costs. So clothing that you might need to wear, stuff for your school, incentives. Yeah, it just depends on what you want to do with your weekends.
Aaron, anything you want to add to what Katie just mentioned?
Yeah, I agree with Katie. I think that it all depends on your lifestyle, whatever you choose to do, like Katie said, on your weekends, or how you choose to spend your money. Some volunteers can budget it really well and end up saving money. Others spend all of it and are waiting for the next stipend at the end of the month. For outer islanders, they have nothing really to buy on island, and their host families receive a stipend for supporting them for their food. So they really only have the initial cost of buying things to prepare them to go out to Outer Island, and that's something they have to be prepared for when they arrive. And then for macro placements, I just want to note that there's kind of a difference. If you don't live with a host family, it's $350, but if you live with a host family, it's $150 if you're in an urban area. So for Madro with a host family, it's $150, but if you're living on your own, it's $350. And that's the same for Outer Islands that don't live with host families, and that includes Ebi and Jalowit, where the volunteers live in teacher housing, so they have to do all of their own cooking and that type of thing. So anyone who's living on their own is $350. And for Madro, they find it a little bit more difficult typically to budget. But like Katie said, it depends on how you choose to kind of manage it. And if you want to go out on weekends, if you want to go to the restaurants, if you want to kind of maintain the same comforts that you're used to in the States, it's going to be pricey.
Okay. Thank you, Aaron. Micronesia as well. AJ, what do volunteers typically do with their stipend in Micronesia in Pohnpei?
All right, glad we got the chance to talk about that because there's a major difference I find volunteers experience with their stipends. Everybody gets $300 whether they're in Colonia at PIX or CON or in the outer municipalities in Kitchi and Madeline. But the people who end up running into trouble with their stipends, people who are usually strapped for cash at the end of the month, always live in town. There's just more to do in town. There's a fairly large expat community, and if you want to go out to restaurants to eat or drink, we even have a movie theater here. So there's a lot more to spend your money on in town. Those volunteers tend to have trouble. But the volunteers outside of town, in Madeline and Kitchi, have almost no trouble living off of their stipend simply because there's not that much to buy where they live. And I've also found that the outer municipality volunteers tend to spend most of their time in the outer municipalities. Maybe they'll come in once or twice a month to stock up on groceries and head back, but a lot of their time they spend out in the outer municipalities. That being said, if you do budget and eat local food and have a good relationship with local friends, then it's a lot easier to save a few bucks. And usually at the end of the month, if people have some extra money, they'll take a boat trip to a picnic island or go out fishing or grab a movie. But the stipend is definitely ample to live on if you budget well.
Great. Thank you, AJ. Moving along to health and safety in our Pacific Island programs. As mentioned, safety precautions are intensely reviewed during orientation. Once you get to your placement, you'll check in with your field staff weekly to ensure everything is going well in the school and in your home. This can be done via email, phone, in person, even over the radio in remote locations. Some volunteers in more urban centers will be able to buy cell phones. In the Marshall Islands, volunteers communicate via shortwave radio. Volunteers in Micronesia and the Marshall Islands will all have life jackets and GPS beacons that they are required to use when they travel by boat. As mentioned, volunteers will receive training on boat and water safety during orientation. Since we're in the Pacific, natural disasters do happen. These storms don't happen frequently, but it's always a possibility in all of these countries. For that reason, we track storm alerts through numerous systems like the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, and processes like our emergency protocol are extremely important in order to maintain communication with all volunteers. This is also the reason why we have health and evacuation insurance. AJ, can you speak to your experience in terms of safety and theft in Pohnpei?
Pohnpei is a relatively safe place to live. Violent crimes rarely ever happen. However, petty theft is it's a pretty common theme, especially among expats. Electronics that get shown off in town, those tend to get stolen once in a while. But like I said, it's never anything violent. Usually somebody's out teaching or out at a restaurant or out shopping. a kid from the neighborhood realizes he or she's gone and climbs in through the smallest hole you could imagine in a window or something. But typically, volunteers get warned about this, and just they understand that they shouldn't show off their electronics. They should, not leave them in plain sight in front of windows, lock doors and windows when you leave, and it's usually pretty fine. Nothing too bad ever happens here. It's a very, very safe place.
Great, thank you, AJ. Aaron, in the Marshalls, maintaining good health at times can be difficult. What is your input on health and illness in the Marshalls, and whether it plays in with your diet? On that note, what is your diet typically day to day?
Okay, so health is it's a bit more difficult to maintain when you're living with a host family or when you're living on Outer Island, just because your options for food are so limited. The typical diet for Marshallese is like white rice, canned meats, some fresh fish, but a lot of like canned tuna, canned mackerel, corned beef, Spam, and then just some local fruits like papaya, banana, things like that. But the majority is white rice. So there's not a lot of variety in the diet. So volunteers are always suggested to bring vitamins with them, bring them out to their Outer Island placements, try and maintain a healthy lifestyle. For people who are living on their own and can eat their own food, basically the more expensive, healthier food, or the healthier food is going to be more expensive. So trying to find a balance and still maintain your health, whether it's exercise or whatever you want to do on your own. There are some things that kind of come along with living here, particularly like waterborne illnesses. You have to sanitize all of your water, whether it's by boiling or if it's purified water that you buy. But we do have quite a few volunteers that get parasites and amoebas and things that you never really expect living in the States, but they kind of become second nature here, and they're really quite simple to take care of, but it's something that a lot of people do experience, whether you're on Outer Island or Madro, if you're kind of bound to get some type of water sickness in some way. But we all just kind of learn to laugh it off, and it's fine.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. Leora, can you give some health and safety insight into American Samoa and some recommendations for potential volunteers?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think here, so having been a volunteer on Kosrae and then now returning to the Pacific in American Samoa, I'm like, oh my gosh, we have everything here. So I think that definitely changed my perspectives on the foods available and even just access to some basic medications. Like there was a time in Kosrae where I was out of Band-Aids. There was nothing like that around. But here you definitely have more access to bandages, basic pharmaceutical stuff. So I would say that you're in a much better position. So if you're living in Manua, you're able to shop at our big grocery store and stock up on health foods. So healthier foods, those could be things like dried beans, canned vegetables, again, vitamins like others were saying. And you can send those out to the outer islands on the boat if you choose to plan ahead and prioritize. On this island, I see sometimes volunteers, especially, again, a similar theme. If you choose to spend more money on activities in town, you might end up buying less healthy and cheaper foods. But I would say that there are healthier food options available here. So even a small mart might sell like brown rice and things like that. So there's whole grain options. So I would say, especially having been a volunteer in Kosrae and now living here in American Samoa, I would say we have great healthy food options that you can buy if you choose to seek them out and then prioritize it for spending. So.
Okay, good relative comparison there. Thank you for that.
Night and day.
Uh-huh. All right, so moving along, we have challenges. So Yes, it's a very, very elaborate word. The challenges that we may have, there's some major cultural challenges in the Pacific for people that haven't been. To start, corporal punishment, which is a culturally acceptable method of child discipline by physical means in the classroom and in the home, may appear in all three countries. So to quickly go through this, Leora, as a field director and previous volunteer, did you ever witness corporal punishment or help other volunteers deal with it in their schools? Can you explain how you or they processed this, if it happened?
Yes. As a volunteer, corporal punishment wasn't something I saw at school, at Kosrae High School. I did, and this was really difficult and hard for me, deal with a lot of my students coming in with visible signs of abuse at home. So that was more of my experience as a volunteer in Kosrae. Here in American Samoa, corporal punishment is definitely integrated into the structure of the school system. So say you send a student to the office, very frequently they go to the office, they're going to be hit by the principal, hit by the vice principal, or say you're working with a co-teacher, that co-teacher's discipline system is likely going to involve some hitting, which is referred to here as sasa, and then that can be really difficult. So I know that volunteers respond to it, and also the way SASA is carried out can be very different among different teachers, school administrators, so everyone's having a really different experience with it here. So just to mentally prepare yourself, if you're working in the public school system here in American Samoa, whether that's on the main island or on the outer islands, it's going to be something that you confront, and then just being really open to talking to someone about it. So explaining to someone else at your school that you trust that if it's upsetting you, if it's triggering something within you that's making it hard for you to work in that school environment, to try to be open with someone at school that you trust. You can always confide in the other volunteers, and then of course always in your field director. So I encourage people to talk to me about it. So it can be traumatic sometimes for volunteers to see students that they care about be hit in school. And I really encourage my volunteers that even if they struggle with classroom management and other teachers are saying, well, why don't you SASA, just to really take pride in knowing that they're working with students and sometimes being the only teacher that they have that won't SASA them in school, and that can be really meaningful to them. So it's really definitely a difficult part of being a part of this school system, but just trying to focus on the positives that you can have as being a teacher and an adult that doesn't hit them.
Can I just add something really quick? I totally agree with all of that, especially because other teachers won't understand why you won't sass kids. And there is one drawback to this, is that I think that WorldTeach has been around in Samoa long enough that Samoan students know that their Palangi teachers aren't going to hit them, and they sometimes take advantage of that. By acting in ways that they would never act for their Samoan teachers. So, you really, in Samoa, because you know you're not going to be hitting your kids, you almost have to be better at disciplining in other ways than the other teachers are. Because your kids are going to try to take advantage of the fact that they know you're not going to hit them. So you really have to come up with other ways.
Thank you. Can you throw things at them, erasers or chalk or something like that? No. Okay, that's frowned upon. What?
I mean, yeah, you can. And
okay.
Honestly, sometimes by the time you leave there, you have violent urges too, because they sometimes are infuriating. But for me, the biggest thing was in Samoan culture, respect is a huge deal, even amongst your worst kids. When it comes down to it, they want your respect and they want other people's respect. And so I just guilt tripped the heck out of my kids all the time. What would your mother think about how you're treating me? This and that. And it usually worked because they don't want to lose face. That's shameful. So I think that for me personally, that was kind of how I handled discipline, was just bringing up the idea of how disrespectful they were being.
Okay, so shame them is a good strategy.
That sounds so harsh. And it makes me sound so mean.
No. But I mean, yeah.
Our vice principal beat them with the 2x4. So I feel like my
It's all
shaming them was
relative.
maybe a little less.
Okay.
It was called he named it. It was called the Board of Education. So
Okay. So moving along, Amber, how would you define the gender roles and norms in American Samoa from the
oh my
perspective
goodness.
from the perspective of a woman? Did this
Okay.
affect the way locals interacted with you?
Um, okay, well, can I just, and I'm sure Leora will totally back me up in this, gender in Samoa is very, very, very strange. At least to someone who grows up here, in the like the Western culture. First of all, there's a third gender in Samoa, which is called Fa'afafine, which is it literally translates to the way of women, which are men, people born as men that are either raised as women or choose to become women at any time in part of their life, and it's totally culturally accepted in Samoa, in a way. Like there are Fa'afafine teachers, and it's not a big deal. But so I don't really think that I had too many negative experiences as a female in Samoa. I mean, Samoans are they do kind of they'll shout things at you as you walk down the street, but I didn't find it to be very like a very machismo culture. But for my field director and my friend who was there, he was gay, and even though they have a third gender that are physically male and identify as females, and that's okay, in Samoa it is not okay for a person who is male to be gay. And so I think it was a struggle for him many times, and also his students just didn't understand. They called him she or her all the time because in their brains, if you are like there is only Fa'afafine and there's no such thing as like a gay male. So it was gender can be very confusing in Samoa, and I think that the hardest thing, I think the people that got it the worst were the people that are volunteers that identified as gay or lesbian, because that was just very culturally taboo in Samoa. Even though they have a third gender, that's totally cool, but the gay thing, not totally cool. So the only thing about being a female in Samoa is like they have some weird superstitions about it. Like if I would walk outside at night and my hair was down, people would yell at me that the ghosts were going to get me because I was being like flirtatious. And then of course, anytime you're seen alone with a male, even if it's your student and you're in your classroom, things like rumors will spread about you. So you have to be really careful about that.
Okay, thank you, Amber. Over to the RMI, the Marshall Islands, Katie, I know many volunteers often struggle to accept that they are working in an education system where the administrators and other teachers potentially don't value or define an education the same way as some of the WorldTeach volunteers do. Can you share your experiences with that?
Sure. I sort of taught on a smaller separate campus. It was part of the elementary school, but it was technically the middle school. So the elementary school was Oceanside, the middle school was Lagoonside, and I taught with 4 other male teachers, which was kind of uncomfortable. And a lot of them didn't show up for school quite frequently, or maybe taught their classes in a way that, I don't know, maybe I didn't agree with. But I would say it's important to focus on the job that you can do and what you can do in your classroom. It's definitely not helpful to confront your fellow teachers about your opinions on their methods, because ultimately you are a guest in the community, and your job is to give the best that you can and try to work with your colleagues as best as you can. And I mean, if people are doing things around you that you don't agree with, it's ultimately not going to be a problem that you can fix in your 10-month stint there. So I would say it can be very frustrating, but it's definitely important to to just do the best job that you can do in your classroom in the time that you're given.
Thank you, Katie. AJ, just quickly, in Pohnpei and Micronesia, are there any particular cultural challenges that you would like to share with people attending the webinar?
Pretty much the same things we've been talking about. Corporal punishment's difficult, gender roles, everything I've heard. It's pretty much the same in Micronesia. Men definitely have an easier time getting things done, especially in the school setting, talking to the administration, which is very frustrating for the female volunteers. Occasionally, female volunteers just ask male volunteers to help out with getting their things done. The male volunteers go ask the administration on behalf of the women, and that seems to work pretty well. But other than that, pretty much everything that we've touched on is fairly consistent in Pohnpei and Micronesia.
Thank you, AJ. Moving on from challenges, we'll talk quickly about the application process and volunteer qualifications. Applicants for our year-long programs must be native or fluent English speakers of any nationality and hold a bachelor's degree. You do not have to have teaching experience, however, a commitment to serving and learning, a flexible attitude are musts. You do not need to know the local language. It will not hurt or help your application. The required application items are listed here, as you can see, as well as on our website, and the process concludes with a Skype interview with our admissions director. Applications for all 3 Pacific Island programs will be accepted until June 16th, and decisions are usually made 2 to 3 weeks after the application is complete. Volunteers will be departing generally in late July, early August, and returning in either June or July of 2017. Right now, we're going to go to a couple of questions that came through both before the webinar as well as one during the webinar. The first one we'll kind of put out to our field directors who are here, Leora, Erin, and AJ. And it's a very general question, but stuff you can elaborate on potentially. What are the best ways to prepare for the program pre-departure that you would recommend to a volunteer? We'll start with Leora and then go to Erin and then AJ.
Okay. Gosh, that's a tough question, but definitely a good one. I think a question you could kind of turn inwards and ask yourself. So something that I would want to mention that I don't feel is always talked about is just to prepare yourself if you have any ongoing health issues. So these could be whether mental health issues, physical health issues, and just really prepare and create a plan for how you're going to support yourself while you're living abroad and to get some of those support systems in place and really have those solid before you go. So whether, say, you were seeing a therapist or someone at home, setting up a way, maybe you could have a plan to give them a phone call before you go, and just really giving yourself that extra support because you don't know what living abroad is going to be like for you. And maybe, you know, it doesn't have to be structured counseling, but that could be with loved ones that you care about and just seeing if there's a plan for extra support that you might want to have in place for yourself. And then any way that you can try to let go of some of your expectations before you leave would be, I would say that would be, if possible, the best preparation is to try to really mentally prepare for an open experience.
I think that is absolutely the most true thing that anyone has ever said.
No.
Yeah, so Erin, any additional words?
Yeah, I was actually going to say the same exact thing. One thing that we talk a lot about during orientation is expectations and being very acutely aware of your expectations. So it's difficult to kind of be aware of your subconscious, but just trying to reflect on that as much as possible pre-departure. I know that everyone, before you're going, everyone's going to be asking you, oh, where are you going to live? Where are you going to teach? And these are often questions that you don't have the answer to. But we kind of have an image in our head of what it's going to be like. So just being very aware of those, but also, like Leora said, being open to it not living up basically to what your expectation was. Oftentimes it's very different, not necessarily bad, but just different. And when our expectations don't match, a reality doesn't match what our expectations are, what people find themselves disappointed or confused or having a tough time adjusting. But just being aware of those and being open to any of the possibilities is what I would suggest kind of before leaving.
Thank you. And AJ, any words of wisdom?
Yeah, things along the same line. Keep your expectations low, definitely. And also, remind yourself, expect the beginning to be very difficult, but remind yourself that you're going to adjust to it just like anything else. Things that could be a major problem the first few weeks you're at your site, in another month might just be everyday stuff that you don't even recognize as being a challenge anymore. So recognize that you'll adapt. Things may be tough, but eventually you'll get the hang of it. And also, I think prepping a little bit to get good insight on the culture. There's an excellent book called Making Sense of Micronesia by Francis Heasel that is a great read and can kind of give you a jump start on understanding why things happen the way they do and navigating the culture, and could get you a nice conversation with your host family upon getting here.
Thank you, AJ. The next question that came in, and I'll direct this more towards Katie and Amber, to be brutally honest. What was the support like during volunteering from the WorldTeach staff? Katie, we can start with you, and then Amber, you can speak about that as well.
Support from WorldTeach staff. I really like both of my field directors. I will say that you have to be self-reliant to a certain extent. When I was first in my placement, they hadn't found a host family for me yet, and at the time that was really hard for me. I felt really isolated from my community, and I was really hoping that the field directors could help me find a placement. Ultimately, I ended up using my community connections to find my own host family placement, and it worked out really well. And so I would just say, if there are obstacles or problems that are going on, and you feel like you're not getting the support that you want from your field staff, definitely try to problem solve it on your own, because your community is typically happy that you're there, and they want to help you to enjoy yourself and to be successful. That being said, there was never if I had a major problem or an illness or I was homesick, I always felt like I could go to my field staff for support, and they would help me get medicine or connect with my family, or in general do anything that I really needed them to do.
I would agree with that. My situation was a little bit different. I was lucky because my field director had been a volunteer just the year before I was there, and also he had taught at the same high school as me, so he knew all the same teachers as I did, and he was my next door neighbor in my village. So when I had a problem, it was really easy to talk to him. I think it's really important to remember that the field directors can only do so much for you, because sometimes they are being challenged by, for instance, the American Samoa Department of Education. And so the most important thing is to not whine and complain if small things are just not that important, and you need to remember that. Like, if you're really sick or you have a really big problem, then yeah, you should approach someone about that. But smaller things, like you're not getting along with your roommate or like that, that's the kind of stuff that, like, at least from what my field director told me, those were really annoying to him because he had a lot to deal with. And at least in American Samoa, the education department is really frustrating sometimes. And so it's not necessarily that your field director is not doing their best. They're doing the best they can do with what they are being given. So it's so important to be self-reliant. And I think a lot of problems arose because people went to Samoa thinking that they were going to Hawaii, that it was going to be a vacation. And if I could give one piece of advice to anybody thinking about applying or anyone who's going, is to remember that you're not on vacation. It is a tropical island, but you're not there to help yourself. You're there to help them. And problems arose, for instance, because in Samoa, people don't really wear swimsuits or bikinis, and people would approach my field director complaining because the village was talking about them because they wore their bikini out swimming in the ocean, and things like that are really dumb to me because you're a guest on their home, and even if you think their culture or rules are strict and stupid, they're theirs, and you're on their home. So I think it's just really important to remember that you're a guest there, and you're there to help them. You're not on vacation. So, and that will save you a lot of problems.
I would also say for some of those, maybe minor problems that you were describing where you might have a problem with your roommate or your host family or things that are obviously important to you but maybe not critical to bring to your field director, your fellow volunteers are a really good resource, shoulder to cry on, ear to bend. So I would say your fellow volunteers are also a great resource for you while you're in country.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And the thing you need to realize is that when you get there, it's going to be really tough. And by the time you leave, you're going to be a person you don't even recognize. When I left Samoa after my first year teaching, I cried every day for a month the first month I was there. And by the time I left, I didn't even recognize how strong mentally of a person I had become. And you have to let yourself do that instead of relying completely on other people fixing your problems.
Amber, Katie, thank you. The final question that came in is for the vegetarians out there. And Leora, Aaron, and AJ, if you can talk quickly about the flexibility of host families, or if they're living in volunteer housing, the realistic possibility of being a vegetarian on one of the islands. If we can we'll start with AJ and then go to Aaron and then Leora.
That's an interesting question. I was actually just having a conversation with some volunteers about being a vegan here. And we determined that it is definitely doable and probably fairly easy if you're willing to sit down and cook for a while. Pretty much there are a ton of different local foods here. Probably the same ones as everywhere else in the Pacific, but breadfruit, a bunch of different kinds of bananas, cucumbers, locally grown eggplants. You can get any beans in the store in cans or dried. We get produce maybe twice a month from off-island, so we get anything from lettuce to tomatoes, jalapenos, and if you search around and make local friends, you can find all that stuff locally grown as well. So it's fairly easy to do, and a benefit of it is that local food is way cheaper than anything from off-island, so it's definitely doable on your own. The first 3 weeks living with a host family during orientation, that might be pretty tough. Typically those meals are fried chicken and fish with rice, but I think certainly they would love to cook you breadfruit and rice, bananas and rice, and give you other vegetables. Cabbage stew was one that I had when I was here. So they definitely understand that some Westerners are vegetarians or vegans, and I think vegan or vegetarian life is definitely possible on Pohnpei.
Aaron, are you there? Leora, can you answer that question? Yes, thank you.
Did Aaron come back? Okay. I think being a vegetarian is definitely possible here. Of course, I would encourage you, especially say it's a church event, or if you're sharing that Sunday after church meal with your family, if it fits within your value system, if it fits within your plans about your own health, to try to eat some meats and fish and local food, just because food is so central to culture that it really is meaningful to be able to fully partake in a meal. That said, I basically eat vegetarian myself here. I don't buy and cook meat for myself, and I think it's very doable with the local shopping options that we have. And even if you're on the outer island, I don't think you'd have as many good alternative protein sources, but in terms of just being full after a Samoan meal, you'd probably be fine with taro and breadfruit and all of the veggie dishes that are also part of a traditional local meal.
Thanks, Leora. Aaron, are you back?
Yeah, sorry, my internet.
Are you still?
Islands.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. I was actually a vegetarian for a number of years before I came here, and I was living with the host family, and I kind of knew that the host family, it would be difficult to be a vegetarian with the host family, basically. It's really not part of their kind of.
Aaron, did we lose you again? Okay. Well, Aaron comes back. We'll finish addressing that final question of being a vegetarian. Those were the questions that came in from our attendees. So I want to go quickly and say thank you for everybody who attended, as well as all of our panelists coming from us from Washington, D.C., near Savannah, Georgia, Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, American Samoa. I think Aaron may be coming back out. But for those who are interested in the program, here are some resources for you, some alumni reviews, which you can see, howsomegoverseas.com of all of our programs, as well as emailing admissions@worldteach.org to speak with a Pacific country expert, which is one of our alumni, as well as watching various day in the life videos. This webinar copy will be sent to you, as well as previous webinars. You can find more information at worldteach.org underneath our Pacific programs, and again, can follow us on any of these social media outlets that you see below. But again, thank you so much for attending. Aaron, are you back?
I am back.
Okay, vegetarian. We'll touch upon that quickly if you can.
Okay, quickly. I wouldn't suggest anyone who's living with a host family to start off the year like that. Basically what I was trying to say is that I was able to establish a good relationship with my family and kind of introduce beans and other options to them, but it's not something that they're used to. It's a lot of canned meats. If you're living on your own, I would say it's doable, but fresh vegetables are kind of unreliable here. We get all of the shipments in from off island, and a lot of times you'll walk into the grocery store and there's no vegetables or they're kind of rotted. So it'll be a lot more frozen goods. There is there's some farming life in Laura at the other end of the island. So anyone who's living on their own in Laura, there's a bit more options. And they're starting to develop more kind of like farmers market things like once a month. So it's something to explore living on Madro. I would say it's doable, but it'll be a little bit more challenging than the States. If you're living with a host family, I wouldn't try and go into it I wouldn't try and be a vegetarian initially, and then you may be able to kind of resort back to it if you're on Madro. On Outer Island, it's really only what's available, and a lot of that is canned meats. I would say it's something that's possible on Outer Island.
Yes, we got it. Thank you, Aaron.
Okay.
So anyway, again, there's just some resources for you, and thank you again to all of our panelists for joining us, and we hope to see you in either American Samoa, the Marshall Islands, or Micronesia. So thank you, everybody, for coming.